You thought being good would be enough, that if you were kind, steady, generous, if you never made her feel unsafe, if you always showed up, always listened, always forgave, she would see you, not just see you standing there, but feel your value. But somewhere along the way, something twisted. You became dependable, but invisible, needed, but not desired, respected in theory, but dismissed in silence. And that pain, the pain of giving everything without being truly seen, that's not about rejection. That's about not being recognized. That's what breaks a man. You didn't fall because you were weak. You fell because you mistook approval for connection. You thought that if you were agreeable enough, peaceful enough, non-threatening enough, she wouldn't leave. You sacrificed your edge for acceptance. You quieted your voice to preserve her comfort. But here's the hard truth. Presence is not built in safety. It's revealed in pressure. Like Zeno of Citium, who lost everything in a shipwreck and didn't try to salvage the past. He let it drown. And from the wreckage, he built something entirely new. That's what this is. Not another tactic, not a performance, but a surrender of the old version of yourself, the one that gave to be chosen. You've lived in the emotional loop, offering love as payment for attention, being soft where you should have been solid. You tried to trade peace for passion, as if playing smaller would make her feel bigger, but all it did was erode your center. You kept giving, not from abundance, but fear. And as Seneca said, a gift loses its worth when it's given from fear, not freedom. That's what made your kindness invisible. Not because it was unworthy, but because it came wrapped in quiet desperation. So let's be clear from the start. This video is not about getting women. This is about you, your voice, your worth, your stillness. This is about reclaiming the part of you that you abandoned in pursuit of approval. Because love that demands your silence is not love, and presence that hinges on permission is not presence. You weren't meant to chase validation. You were meant to stand, not loudly, not violently, but unmistakably. You don't need to change who you are. You need to remember what you forgot, your edges, your boundaries, your weight. This is a lens, a compass, a quiet mirror. And what you'll find here is not comfort, but clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stop trying to be liked and start being real. It doesn't look weak. That's the trap. It looks thoughtful. It looks patient. It looks like you care. But underneath, there's a pattern eating at your spine. Every time you wait for her to calm down before you speak, every time you check her mood before expressing your truth, every time you swallow your instinct to keep the peace, you're not just being considerate. You're asking for permission to exist. And when a man does that long enough, something in him begins to dissolve. At first, it feels like love, like harmony, like you're keeping the relationship stable. But over time, your silence becomes a habit. Not the silence of strength, but the silence of self-erasure. You become more responsive to her tension than to your own convictions. And without realizing it, you stop leading. You stop initiating. You begin walking on emotional eggshells that were never even spoken aloud. And still, you call it love. There's science behind this too. But we won't stay there long. Chronic people-pleasing changes the male brain. It activates the same regions associated with social threat, with emotional rejection. Your nervous system starts to adapt, not to strength, but to submission. You shrink not because you don't care, but because you've trained yourself to survive rejection instead of facing it. But presence doesn't come from obedience. It comes from weight, edge, stillness, not sharpness, but anchored clarity. A man who waits for cues becomes forgettable. A man who moves with quiet certainty becomes undeniable. The difference isn't volume, it's foundation. That grounded presence, the kind that can walk into a storm and not flinch, that's not built through agreement. It's built through self-respect, not the loud kind, the lived kind. So ask yourself, where in your life have you been waiting for emotional permission? Where have you mistaken patience for peace, softness for strength? Because a man who knows his truth doesn't ask for space to speak it. He simply does, and not to dominate, but to exist fully, quietly, and completely. You were told to be kind, to never raise your voice, to be the stable one, and maybe you believed that would make you unforgettable. But instead, you disappeared, not all at once, slowly, quietly. She stopped leaning in when you spoke, stopped waiting for your opinion, stopped feeling the pull of your presence. You didn't notice it at first, because nothing exploded, but that's how men fade. Not with violence, but with compliance. She didn't stop loving you because you were unkind. She stopped respecting you because you were harmless, predictable, soft, where life demanded weight. And in her silence, you kept trying to become smaller, thinking that if you just avoided conflict, she'd come back. But here's the truth. No one told you. Safety is not the same as attraction. Familiarity isn't the same as fire. Women don't need danger, but they do need depth. And depth always carries discomfort. Zeno didn't teach by making people feel good. He taught through contradiction, through paradox. Because what wakes a person up isn't ease, it's tension. The kind that challenges what they thought was true. That's what masculinity does when it's grounded. It doesn't soothe. It doesn't chase peace. It creates an atmosphere where clarity can't be ignored. You don't have to be aggressive, but you do have to be clear. You do have to risk not being understood. Because respect isn't born in agreement, it's born in tension. That sacred space between who you are and what they want you to be. If you're always adjusting, always smoothing, always softening, you become forgettable. Not because you lack love, but because you lack presence. A man doesn't need to be dangerous, but he cannot be invisible. He must be willing to disrupt, to discomfort, to stand. Not with noise, with gravity, because that's where respect begins. In the space where you stop performing and start being, even if it makes others uncomfortable. Especially then, you told yourself it was love. You gave and gave and gave until there was almost nothing left of you. You called it devotion, loyalty. But deep down, you were hoping she'd finally see you, finally choose you. Not because you were loud, but because you never left, because you were always there. But that's the lie. That's the trap of the nice guy. You weren't giving out of fullness. You were negotiating, quietly, constantly. You were trading pieces of yourself for the illusion of connection. Love becomes performance when you're afraid of being forgotten. And performance always comes with expectations. That she notice, that she appreciate, that she stay. And when she doesn't, it feels like betrayal. But it isn't betrayal, it's feedback. She didn't reject you. She rejected the mask. The carefully crafted identity built on being useful, agreeable, and available. The man who gives in order to be chosen is not in love. He's in survival. This isn't about becoming colder. It's about becoming true. When your value depends on how she responds, you're never free. You're always adjusting, editing, adapting, hoping she'll finally say, "You're enough." But what if the real shift begins when you stop asking to be picked? When your kindness no longer comes with strings? When your presence no longer needs applause? There's a power that lives in stillness, in giving without needing, in loving without losing yourself. And that's where masculine dignity begins. Not when you win her over, but when you no longer need to. Not when she chooses you, but when you choose truth over transaction. That's when you stop performing and start existing, not as a strategy, but as a man. You stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you thought it was wise. You believed silence would show maturity, that by not reacting, not confronting, not creating tension, you were holding the relationship together. But silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's surrender in disguise. Sometimes it teaches her the wrong lesson, that your truth can be ignored without consequence. Every time you held your tongue to avoid an argument, she didn't see your patience, she saw your absence. Every moment you tolerated what tore at your core, she didn't feel your depth, she felt your distance. What you thought was restraint looked like retreat, and in that retreat, the polarity began to fade. Because a man who won't speak his boundary becomes a man who doesn't feel like a boundary. And without that edge, there's no spark. Just safety, just structure, just quiet fading. Containment doesn't mean avoidance. It means presence without explanation. It means stillness that holds its ground. Women don't need noise, but they do need to feel that you're there. Not just physically, energetically, emotionally. And a man who's buried his fire beneath layers of tolerance loses that presence. Slowly, silently, entirely. Epictetus said, "Don't explain yourself. Be." That's not an excuse to disappear. It's a call to exist with weight. You don't have to justify your boundaries. You don't have to defend your truth. But you do have to embody it. Speak when needed. Withdraw when necessary. But never confuse silence with wisdom if it costs you your soul, because she will mirror what your silence permits. And if your presence disappears, don't be surprised when her respect follows. She pulled away, subtly at first, less warmth in her voice, less weight in her gaze. The rhythm of affection slowed, then stopped. And in that silence, something inside you panicked. You thought, I must have done something wrong. So you leaned in, texted more, explained yourself, offered more help, gave more softness, not because you were certain, but because you were afraid. Afraid of what it would mean if she really left. But trying harder isn't always love. Sometimes it's a quiet confession that you've made her opinion of you the center of your worth. Every time you reached out hoping for reassurance, you weren't fighting for the relationship. You were begging for identity. That's what nice guys do after rejection. They double down, not on their truth, but on their usefulness, as if being more available, more generous, more understanding will erase the rejection. But it doesn't. It deepens it, because in her eyes, you don't look strong. You look lost. A man who cannot sit with the sting of rejection becomes a man who will sacrifice himself just to feel accepted again. And the more you chase her attention, the more she sees that your self-respect is negotiable, that your presence depends on her permission. And once that's gone, so is the polarity. There's a shift that happens when you stop trying to win her back and start asking what that effort is really about. When you stop making her your mirror and start becoming your own axis. When you stop looking for what you did wrong and start seeing what you had been ignoring. Rejection isn't failure. It's information. Not about your worth, but about your alignment. And sometimes the most honest answer isn't to try harder. It's to stop trying at all, to stand in what's true, even if it hurts. Especially then, because your soul wasn't built to be negotiated. It was built to be known. It didn't happen when she walked out the door. It didn't happen in the silence, the distance, or the final conversation. It happened long before that. Quietly, invisibly, when you said yes to something your soul knew was wrong. When you betrayed your own truth to keep the peace. When you swallowed your instinct because you were afraid to lose her. That's when she stopped looking at you the same way. Not because she wanted to, because you taught her that your center could be moved. Respect doesn't vanish in explosions. It dissolves in small moments. Micro signals. You let a boundary slide. You apologized when you didn't need to. You hesitated when strength was required. And while she may not have said a word, she felt it. The inconsistency. The softness where there should have been solidity. And in those moments, trust quietly eroded. Not because you were cruel, but because you weren't clear. Masculine leadership isn't about control. It's about containment, direction, the ability to make the hard call before the chaos arrives. But when you delay decisions, when you defer to ease, when you avoid confrontation under the banner of harmony, you become passive. And passivity doesn't feel safe. It feels uncertain. That uncertainty breeds resentment. And slowly, the woman who once leaned on your strength begins to look elsewhere. Not for someone stronger, but for someone more anchored. There's a story in almost every man's life. A moment he looks back on and realizes, that was it. That was when I chose peace over truth. That was when I abandoned myself, so I wouldn't be abandoned by her. But in the end, he lost both, the relationship and his reflection. Because no woman can respect a man who doesn't respect his own edge. And no man can lead, love, or last if he's afraid to be alone with his own decision. It doesn't require an outburst. It doesn't need a final speech or a slammed door. The moment a man reclaims his authority is often invisible to the world. No spotlight, no applause. Just a shift, internal, subtle, complete. It's the decision to stop asking, stop explaining, stop negotiating his value in the eyes of others. It's not louder, it's not colder, it's clearer. You don't chase anymore, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand. Clarity doesn't pursue validation. It moves with direction. And in that movement, people either follow or fall away. But you no longer bend. You no longer stall your truth to protect someone else's comfort. You speak less, but when you do, it lands. You act with fewer words, but each step is anchored. Masculine authority is not force. It's presence. The kind that doesn't flinch under pressure. The kind that doesn't need to be right to remain still. The kind that draws lines, not to punish, but to preserve. And the man who draws those lines does so without resentment, without blame, without noise. He's not proving anything. He's remembering who he is. There comes a moment when you stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What do I stand for?" That's the moment the axis shifts. From external to internal. From approval to alignment. From performance to embodiment. And with that shift, your yes becomes strong. Your no becomes sacred. You no longer need to be understood to be respected. You simply become undeniable, because nothing about you asks to be seen. You are not what you offer. You are not what she accepts. You are what remains when there's nothing left to give but presence, not explained, not defended, just embodied. And in that quiet embodiment, something ancient returns. Authority, not over others, over yourself. Zeno lost everything in a single storm: his ship, his possessions, the life he had built. But what he found in that wreck wasn't just philosophy, it was identity. He didn't try to rebuild the same life. He let it go, and in its place, he became something quieter, sharper, undeniable. That's the invitation now. Not to become colder, not to become someone else, but to become more precise. To remember what got buried beneath the performances, to find the man you were before you believed you had to trade your truth for love. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to demand to be respected. Stillness speaks louder than desperation. Clarity holds more power than persuasion. And boundaries, not sacrifice, are what reveal your worth, not just to her, but to you. Marcus Aurelius said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That doesn't mean being perfect. It means being whole, grounded, true, especially when it's uncomfortable, especially when it costs you approval. Because dignity doesn't live in how much you're willing to give. It lives in how clearly you know when to stop. Picture yourself now, not reacting, not chasing, not folding, a still flame in the wind, not moving to be seen, just burning. Because that's what fire does. That's who you are beneath the noise. You don't need her to see it. You just need to stop hiding it. Let the old version of you drown, and don't save him. Build the man who doesn't need to be chosen to know his own value. Quiet, present, unshakable.